So Mary Kennedy, thank you so much for joining us. We're going to talk today about the Dochas Centre from the brand new Virgin Media documentary, Women Locked Up Inside the Dochas. It is the first time I've ever seen Inside the Dochas, and it's somewhere I've always been curious about, as somebody who's watched a lot of Orange is the New Black. But tell us a little bit about, I suppose let's start with the basics. What is the typical day like in the Dochas Centre for the inmates?
Well, good morning, Clodagh, and you're in for a treat. So you will get a good insight into what it's like inside in the Dochas. So a typical day, well, it will all depend on a few factors, depending on what stage of the journey the prisoner's at, from committal through their custody right through to release. But typically, it is a structured day, and the day will start off at around 8 o'clock in the morning. Prisoners will be unlocked. The women will get their breakfast. They will queue up for medication. Quite a lot of them are on medication. And they will return back to their rooms. They will eat their breakfast. And then again at 9:15, they will be unlocked from their rooms. They'll do their little bits and bobs and tidy up their rooms. And then they will go to structured activities. So what I mean by structured activities are, it'll be either education, which is the school, or work and training, or they may be working in, say, for example, the kitchen or the barista or industrial cleaning. So they will do that until just before noon, and they will return to collect their lunch, and they will bring their lunch back to their rooms, and they will have some time in the rooms until they're unlocked again at around 2 o'clock. And at 2 o'clock, they will go back out again for more structured activities. So they can go to various different classes, about 15 different classes that are available to them. And they will alternatively go to work and training, or they will be working again in some of the jobs that they do. And then same again at tea time. They will collect their evening meal, and they will have that in the room and unlocked again for what's called the reserve. And the reserve is from around 5 o'clock until just around 7:30. And they will have various activities, recreation, exercise out in the yard, and then back to being locked up again at 7:30. Now, I mentioned that there were some variables.
Yeah.
So some of those variables will depend on what stage of the prisoner journey that they're in. So typically when the women come into custody, they're on our committal unit, and some of them may be mentally unwell. So what we aim to do is to stratify our risk, and we keep our committals together, we keep our mentally unwell women together, and that's for the purpose of being seen and assessed and risk managed and progressed. And maybe the sentence managers might at some point come down and interview them as well. So that's very important. So their activities and what they do for a day is structured a little bit differently. So another variation would be if a prisoner is on protection. So we have some women that need protecting, not many, but we do have some, and some of their regimes are restricted. But we make every effort to manage that as positively as possible in the woman's best interest. So that would be another variation. And then another variation would be the structure of the day would change, obviously, if they're attending court or if they're going to hospital, or they might need to be seen by the nurse or the sentence manager, or they might have an appointment with probation or psychology. So there's a few different variations. All in all, their day is really, really structured. And but as I say, there can be variations to that.
And tell us about those sort of educational classes. What is available to the women in the Dochas Centre? How many? There's about 180 at any given time women in the centre. What are the educational classes available to them, and what are those sort of recreational activities that are also available to them? How do you run so many classes for such a small amount of people?
Okay, well, so Clodagh, education is very important, as you know, from childhood, and the literature will tell you that even from early childhood it's extremely important. A lot of the women may not have had access to the same education that other people in society have had. So there is a huge emphasis on education in the prison system, and it's titrated and tailored to suit the educational needs of the prisoner. So for the women, there are about 15 different classes. It can range from art to literature. I'm not a teacher myself, but I do know that there's loads of different classes available. There's maybe drama as well and music. Then there are some specific ones. There's blended learning. We've had one woman who actually successfully completed her open university.
Oh, very good.
And we have specific training for barista, which is really, really popular. And it's to mimic some skills for when they leave, which is the idea. So it's not all academical. And there's also some pre-release training as well. Our head teacher is very good at sourcing different educational materials. And we have a hairdresser in there as well. So there's different courses to suit different educational needs. So the school is usually very well subscribed. And it's on 2 different levels. There's also computer training as well. So lots of educational materials.
There's a range of things of interest, not only to the women in terms of their skill set, but also, I suppose, it's an opportunity to try out different things and see what's right for you, what you're interested in, what you're good at.
Absolutely, Clodagh. And some of the women will tell you that they were pleasantly surprised in some of the classes. And it's not all, as I said, academic. Some of it would be Dochas Has Got Talent. The school has put on different shows. We had Intercultural Week held and organised by the teachers. So there's different activities as well, which is very good. It improves the atmosphere, and it also allows the women to be very creative as well.
Because it's a community in itself as well, its own kind of micro ecosystem almost in the prison, you know.
Completely. That is one thing about Dochas is it is a community, but it's a community within a community.
Yeah.
So it's not a little cocoon on its own.
You could really see that from the documentary, sort of, you know, the prison guards kind of walking around, morning, how are you? Morning, how are you? Kind of everyone knows each other, everyone's familiar with each other's routines and everything like that. But I want to talk to you about, you know, as a woman in prison, as a female who is a governor of an all-female prison, that experience, you know, it's completely different to the male experience behind bars for a number of different reasons. But I want to talk to you a little bit about what is the difference in terms of the experience for the woman. I mean, you're looking at, the ripple effect. Family is affected in different ways to men, their health, their well-being. I suppose even in terms of their punishment, you know, that can be seen in different ways, you know, punished for being outside of the norms of what a woman should be and should do, and then also maybe lenient as well. So there are, you know, in terms of penal issues there. But that's all kind of outside of in the courtroom before they even get to the Dochas Centre. But what is it like as a woman compared to a man in prison?
That's a very good question. Clodagh, the starting point is what's known as the Bangkok Rules. And without being too pedantic, it is internationally recognised by the United Nations General Assembly that we have minimum standards for prisoners in general. So the Bangkok Rules don't replace them, they actually augment them, but they're gender specific. And it is recognised that women are different. And the very first principle is that equality, we're all entitled to equality. But because women are different, it's not discrimination. In fact, it enhances equality, that we are entitled to be treated differently as women in general, because we're women, but specifically in prison. And the reason for it is that the indices of their offences tend to be different to men. They tend to be less violent. They tend to be shorter sentences. The women have gender-specific needs. They have families are very often the sole carer of the families. There's also, they can be pregnant while in prison. They can have babies while they're in prison. And obviously they have menstrual cycles and they have menopause. They may suffer from a miscarriage. But typically for a lot of the prisoners, they come from a background where they would have had what's known as ACEs, which are adverse childhood experiences, and that can sometimes be generational. Some of the women, quite a few of them in fact, may have been victims of serious crime themselves. They may have been trafficked. They may have been pimped for prostitution, sexually abused, emotionally abused. And you can see that a lot more in a female setting than you can in a male. So when we talk about looking after women in prison, yes, security and safety is paramount, but security is not just procedural and physical, it's also dynamic. So you mentioned that in the documentary you saw that the officers were engaging with the women. That's a good thing. And the reason it's good is because it's dynamic and because it's a professional relationship, and that it's only by having a trauma-informed approach and by being able to engage with the women that we can have some sort of impact, like a role model. So, for example, you might remember having a favourite teacher or somebody that had a positive influence on you. So that's all very important in our brief interventions and interactions with women on a day-to-day basis in the prison, because they're women. So obviously, because of the Bangkok rules, it's not just the acknowledgement that they're different, we also have to treat them differently. And you mentioned that maybe how we deal with them with sanctions might be a little bit different as well. So we can impose sanctions following what's known as a P19 hearing, and that could be it's a disciplinary sanction for a misconduct. So the process is the same as any fair procedural process. You have the hearing, and if there's a finding that the woman that there was a misconduct, and there can be, when you're imposing the sanction, you have to be careful that you don't maybe limit family visits, or that you don't restrict phone calls, because that may be a very necessary link to maintain relationships with their family. And that's touched upon in the Bangkok rules, is the importance of maintaining those family ties. So there's also other things, Clodagh, like the importance of medical care. And that's I've worked in about 7 different prisons, and the female, from the medical point of view, is very different to the male. And I do have a nursing background, so I can identify with the needs of the women from that perspective. And we have an excellent, you'll see it in the documentary as well, an excellent healthcare service which actually meets the needs in accordance with the Bangkok rules. Yeah, it is interesting, very much so, I suppose, that when I was watching the documentary, and they kind of spoke a lot about the differences for women in terms of the repercussions that it has on their families, because often these women, if their partner is also in the prison system, which is likely the case in, you know, if a woman is in the system, her partner may also be the father of her children. And they touched on the fact that these kids can sometimes end up in care because of that. How is, I suppose, the approach then from, you know, the Dochas Centre in terms of making sure that those bonds with their kids are, nourished, and I suppose kind of held up as not to dangle a carrot and say you have to get out to see your kids, but I suppose sort of as an ambitious goal for them to, want to get out and stay out, because that's something that as well a lot of them spoke about, was the fact that it was this kind of a revolving door. They were in prison, they did really well, and then they kind of fell off and ended up back there. So how is that impacted on the family? Yes, it does impact on the family, and it impacts on the woman herself as well, which further impacts on the family. Yeah. So the nurture nature theory is very, very important, as we know, from a psychological point of view and from a child developmental point of view. And more research is coming out on that in early developmental years and the formative years, and how impressionable children are, and the human bond between particularly a mother and her children. And we see that in Dochas, where a lot of children are taken into care. We see where maybe other relatives are looking after the children for the women, and that it's heartbreaking for the women, but that's not to minimise that they are in to serve their time for their crime. However, our role is to try and nurture that bond as best we can. So we have a few things. We have groups that come in that help with parents under pressure, that give coaching on parenting skills. There are some external services, voluntary services that come in as well. We are looking at motherhood and even grandparenting. Then there's other things like how we interact with the women ourselves. I mentioned that we do have some women that are pregnant, that have other small children at home. And I also mentioned that in imposing the sanctions that we don't restrict reasonable access. And then we allow family visits and we allow interactions with small children as well. We welcome all that and promote it. So in terms of supporting the women, then we have, we actually, we need to kind of support the grandparents as well. And I can personally identify with that because I'm a grandmother myself, and the bond intergenerationally is very, very important. We've very close connections with Tusla as well. But it's important to mention, Clodagh, as well, that it's children first and we can't put anybody at any unnecessary risk. So we do have very good links with the help of our probation service and with healthcare as well, that we can, we can't reverse where somebody is, placed into care, but we do have case conferences, and we do maintain very, very good links that way. And as I say, we do get in external volunteers and agencies, and we're tapping into whatever resources are available to help with that. And there is a relatively new initiative. I don't have all the details with me, but the basis of it is it's actually to do with inner Dublin city and disadvantaged communities having access to early childhood intervention and education. So we do have one lady that is starting to come in, and she's speaking to some of the mothers that are expecting and some of the different play mats, because play is education. And for two of our women that have had babies in there, they have been introduced to the concept of the importance of play from 0 to 2 years of age. So we're adapting all that. And all of that is in keeping with the Bangkok rules as well.
Yeah. So it is important for women to have that access to their kids. And again, like with the Bangkok rules, it's I suppose the sense is, women, you want to be equal to men, maybe not treated the exact same as them, obviously, to be treated in a way that's fair and just for the women. But when it comes to that, I suppose one thing that we see a lot as well in the documentary is this running theme of both poverty and addiction. And I think both, maybe it's fair to say, feed into one another in different ways. It's women who are in there because, they might have been stealing, whatever food or whatever it might be for their kids to provide for their family. It's a very kind of different dynamic. But when it comes to that theme of poverty and addiction, I know at the point when women come to you in the Dochas Centre, they're kind of, they've offended, they've been convicted, and now they're going to serve their time. What do you think are, from your experience, as both a woman, a nurse, somebody who's been around these women for so long, what do you think are the risks? What do you think needs to be done to reduce the risk of poverty and addiction and women even getting to that point in the first place where they're with you?
Okay, well, Clodagh, one of the first things...
Very philosophic question, I know. Very loaded.
It is, but if we just break it down a little bit, because one of the startling things that struck me when I came to Dochas 2.5 years ago was how much more impoverished women were compared to their male counterparts in the male prisons. And I noticed that they didn't have as much clothes, they didn't have the runners, they didn't have the same family support to bring them up property or money compared to men. And I also noticed that they had less in their accounts and that they were impoverished by comparison. I also noticed that, and I know you just mentioned there about treating people equally, but it's not actually discrimination to treat one person more equally than another.
Yeah.
So you treat equals equally, and you can treat unequals unequally, and that's provided in our Constitution, and Aristotle said it as well. So it is actually equality, and that's the first principle of the Bangkok Rules, is that you can treat women a little bit more favourably in recognition of the gender imbalance. So just to touch on that point, in terms of their poverty, there's lots of literature, and without getting too academic, but there are links between addiction, mental health, homelessness, lack of education, leading to crime and coming into our criminal justice system. We can't do a huge amount of that directly, but what we can do is we can focus when they come in on rehabilitating them. And we mentioned about the educational system in Dochas. We can promote that, and we can try and rehabilitate them to give them the choices, so that when they go back out, they may have better options available to them. So, if you have somebody that's impoverished and they're addicted to drugs, and they have a trauma background, and they have a mental illness, and maybe a personality disorder because of all the trauma, the odds are stacked against them, and particularly for a woman, given their history, because very often, until I would see them in the morning along with the other governor on parade, that's what we call parade when we see them, and when they open up and tell you some of their backgrounds, it is amazing. So the literature will also tell you that women that come from impoverished backgrounds, that are poverty-stricken, that are unwell, that have had a trauma experience, are more likely to offend, but their offences are less likely to be as severe as the male counterparts. That's also mentioned in the Bangkok Rules. So we acknowledge that. So what we do then is to try and rehabilitate them. So we do that by not just locking up prisoners, or particularly our women, not just locking them up, but actually incentivising them to engage in structured activities such as education, work and training, working in the hairdressing, working in the barista, learning how to serve out coffees. And I should have mentioned earlier that a lot of the educational courses and the work and training are certified. They're at different levels, QQI levels, and that will enable them to have that certificate to go back out and to try and get a job. So that's the aim of it. Yes, some do come back in, and one of our values in our strategic plan, our current one, is to recognise that everybody has potential. So each and every one of the prisoners, while they are in for a crime, and that has to be acknowledged, they still have potential. And even aside from education, and I mentioned earlier, we all remember role models from our own past, and you mentioned that the officers engage with the women. That's all very good, because something as simple as a positive interaction with our women can have a positive impact. For a little bit of kindness, a little bit of human compassion, and a little bit of understanding through a trauma-informed lens can actually do a lot for a woman. It's not necessarily going to sort everybody's problems, but it helps. And a little bit of help is worth more than a lot of sympathy.
Yeah, and I think as well, one of the things that we see in the documentary, which was, I think every woman who told the story, they were all incredibly powerful. But there was something incredibly wonderful to see, in the sense that there was a previous inmate who would kind of come back and was doing like a focus group, or not a focus group, but a support group, a talk therapy almost group with the other women, and they were able to come and share their fears. One had spoken about the fact that she was getting out on temporary release. She was excited to rebuild her relationship with her family, and she had this, oh no, I'm terrified I'm going to end up taking drugs again. And the ex-inmate, the former inmate, was kind of able to talk through those fears with her. And I think that's such a powerful thing to have somebody who's walked in your shoes and is, 10 steps ahead of you to able to give that perspective. And it really was a powerful part of the documentary. I thought maybe not kind of as much so as others, but I just thought that was a crucial thing. How do you find the women engage with role models like that who have been there, walked in their shoes and understand compared to somebody maybe like yourself who I'm assuming hasn't, done a custodial sentence or something like that, or other people who have come in and done custodial sentence? Exactly, I thought so. And they're obviously, you're in that prison every day. You're part of that community as well, but you're not kind of in the same mindset or, set of rules as they are. So how do you find that they react to that sort of role model compared to somebody else who is, still as equal and, incredible in leading and guiding and helping. But I suppose there is a bit of a difference there.
I think you're quite right. It is extremely powerful. And in fact, wouldn't any of us turn to our own peers to look for a bit of advice or, a little conversation on the side, especially if you haven't dipped your toes in the water for something? Wouldn't it be more powerful to go to a colleague or somebody in your own situation or that was there before and get the heads up on one or two things? That's extremely powerful.
Yeah.
And I think we should tap into it. And we do tap into it, and we have the care after prison. We also have other things along that same principle. So we would have the Red Cross, and that's peer support as well. And that's also very positive, whereby prisoners are trained up for community health and first aid. And the concept is that you live in a community, which it is in Dochas, with your peers, which are your fellow female prisoners. And you promote better living, you learn to negotiate. And they are very, very useful skills for when they're released, but they will listen to their peers. So I don't want to say that it's self-policing. I think that's a little bit too strong, but it's impactful. And likewise, if you have somebody that had a history of addiction or had a history of crime and managed to maybe turn their lives around positively, and if they can be influential, I think that's even more powerful than us saying this is what you're supposed to do and this is not what you're supposed to do. Yeah. It's powerful, and it certainly complements the dynamic of positive engagement between staff and the women. And then I mentioned the Red Cross. Like we have other, like we have a Goshka Awards as well. We're just tapping into that now. So that's all very positive. And just for the women to learn to empower themselves, because a lot of them would have been maybe coercively controlled, would have been under duress maybe to commit some crimes, would have been abused, trafficked, as I mentioned earlier. So if they can learn to have a voice, if they can learn to accept maybe some education and some skills, that all helps towards rehabilitation. So we have a prisoners' council, which was set up just over a year ago. You'll see that in the documentary as well. And it's not a them and us. It's actually where we sit around a round table and they bring up issues as they see them that have been communicated to them from other prisoners. And they will address them with us, and we learn from this as well. And we see what can be changed, and what, if we can make things a little better, it's a little easier, and it's actually more rehabilitating. So that's all towards rehabilitation.
And like I said, the Dochas Centre is not something you get a glimpse into, as a member of the public often, or ever really. When you welcomed the Virgin Media cameras in, were you apprehensive and nervous about that?
A little bit, but to be honest with you, a few of the pillars of the strategy, the current strategy for the prison service, is that we improve prisoner care pathways, the employee experience, and new processes, new way of looking at things. But one of the one of the pillars is governance, and I'd be familiar with that because for any organisation it needs oversight, it needs governance, but we need to let the outside in. And I do recall from my previous work as a nurse, I was familiar with the learnings from Judge Maureen Clark in relation to the Drogheda report, where if an organisation is in a cocoon of its own confidence, it's not going to develop, it's not going to grow, it's never going to see what its own maybe failings are or how it can progress. So it's only by inviting the outside in, different disciplines, different organisations in to see what we are. The main objective is a lot of people don't know what it's like inside in a prison. They especially don't know what it's like inside Dochas. And some of it is a perception from television. You mentioned from Orange. Yeah, Orange is the new black.
Yeah.
So maybe having seen Orange is the new black and compare that to Dochas, you might see it very, very, very differently. So it's good to let the outside in, not in a sensational way and not exploiting the women in any way, but actually just to see what it is and what the benefits of empathy and compassion. And I grew up with the concept from my parents that a little bit of humanity goes a long way, and that a little bit of help is worth more than a lot of sympathy.
Yeah.
And that's one of my values that I take into it. And I think that can be seen in the documentary, that a helping hand is worth more than just locking women up. And you have to see it from where they're coming from and rehabilitate them and gear them towards making the right lifestyle choices, because some of the reason they're in is because their lifestyle choices have been hugely risky.
Yeah.
Possibly coming from their backgrounds, but their lifestyle choices have led to maybe a criminal behaviour, and also mental and physical ill health. That's quite prevalent.
And now that the cameras have been in, there's been 3 episodes recorded. I've only seen the first one, so I'm very excited to see the final 2. But what is it that you want the population to take away from seeing that? Because like you said, I watch a show like Orange is the New Black, and of course my brain straight away goes to, well, I wonder what the Irish version of this is like. What is it like in the Dochas Centre? Do they have somebody driving the vans around from there? All these questions I had, and, I suppose can only be answered to a limited circumstance. It's going to be the first time a lot of people see inside a prison, never mind see inside something like the Dochas Centre, because I think it's so specific and unique. So what is it you want people to take away from it?
Well, actually a few things. There's no secrets. However, Dochas is 25 years old this year.
Is that all?
That's all.
Wow.
Yeah, 1999. And nurses are in the prison service 25 years this year as well.
Is that all? My gosh. Yeah. Wow. Yeah. Okay.
And the Bangkok rules are 15 years old next year. So a lot of progress has happened. I think there can be a misconception that, once they come into prison, that it's lock them up, the punishment befits the crime. But it's bigger than that. It's much more complex. And I think it's good for the general public to see that. And I think it's important to emphasise that the judgment is with the courts and the judge, the presiding judge. And once they come into prison, we look after them. We try to rehabilitate them. So it's safe and secure custody with dignity in order to rehabilitate the prisoners for a safer community. And the message to get across is that if we look after the community that's within the wider community and rehabilitate them going back out, it's actually going to benefit society in the bigger picture. So we can look at it very narrowly and say, lock them up, throw away the key, punishment befits the crime. And yes, we have to respect that there are victims as well. But we also have to look at the much bigger picture, that it is our society within the bigger society, and that we have to do something to help.
Yeah, so I suppose you want people to look at it and not be, as a warning, this is where you're going to go if you do bad things. It's more of this is what happens. These women are human. They have, they've come from different walks of life.
Yes.
There was a pregnant woman in it. There was another woman that I see in the documentary who had been kind of bullied into having drugs smuggled into the prison. They're all very complex issues. You might sit there and think, well, I'd never do that, but you don't actually know until you're in their shoes.
Yes, because that's a very black and white way to look at it. But it is, as you say, it's much more complex, it's much more dynamic, and there's a bigger picture behind it all. So it's important to emphasise as well that helping somebody is much better than just locking them away, and that there's a value for that, and that there are innocent people in the background, like their children, and their parents and their grandparents and other extended family. So they're in the background as well. And it could be any one of us. So there has to be a bit of human compassion in there as well. And coming from a caring background and working with a very high functioning multidisciplinary team in there, and the staff are wonderful. But the multidisciplines come together to try and promote that rehabilitation and to help the women try and turn over a new leaf and try and make something positive of the rest of their life. And you'll see that in the documentary. It's an extremely strong multidisciplinary team. So we have our healthcare, we have psychology, the chaplaincy, and we have obviously our operational staff as well. We have probation service. We have in-reach services, we have housing, we have all the disciplines come together, and we talk about how we might manage a particular case. We have case conferences, and it's important for this documentary to demonstrate that it's not just they're gone to prison. And the other thing that's really, really important as well is that aside from the fact that the judgment has happened in the court and they've come in, the loss of liberty is huge. You don't need to do anything else. The loss of liberty on its own is huge. So the doors are locked at 7:30. So there's no going down to the takeaway and getting a pizza for yourself. And you can't just decide, in the middle of the night that you're going to order a curry or something, or obviously you can't
head down to Pennies or whatever,
So there's huge limitations to your loss of liberty. And that's just the way it is.
Yeah. And another, I suppose, thing that was kind of woven through it as well was addiction. And I suppose that's part of the multidisciplinary approach, is to address that and the risk factors that are involved with it. But what does sort of, I suppose, things like drugs in prison, what is the ripple effect of that on the community in the prison itself? Never mind how they get in or why they get there and the punishments for doing so, bring drugs in. What is the effect that it has on the community?
Well, drugs and addictions are a scourge in our society. And that's because we're a community within a community, that's going to spill over. So it's no different in Dóchas than it is in the community, other than the fact that the addiction issues may be higher. So if the drugs weren't there in the first place, we'd all be better off. So, and drug addiction is not selective in terms of society classes. Drug addiction can affect anybody. So, but obviously, if you have had a trauma background, you might make that wrong lifestyle choice, more so than if you didn't.
Yeah.
So that's important to bear that in mind as well.
Definitely.
So the prison service last year brought out a drug strategy, and it's circular. There's a few different tenets to it, but it's based on obviously detecting and reducing drugs coming into prison. So that's number one. And number two is to treat and support. And number three is to educate. So in terms of reducing and detecting, so how do we know they're coming in? So it's ingenious. and we do have nets over our yards, and you might have seen that during one of the storms, the nets came down, but they're back up again. So they're very necessary. And the prison service has Operation Throw Over, so that's from an organisational point of view, strategically looking at how these drugs are coming in and different methods of throw-overs and how we counteract them. So I can't give away any secrets on that, Clodagh. And we also have the Operations Support Group, so they will support, and we have detector dogs, so we have X-ray machines, so we've lots of different things to counteract that. But as I say, I can't give away that. So there's a lot of investment in that, and I think it is as it says, Operations Support Group. So it supports the prison in that sense. So if you can prevent it, so that strategy somehow mirrors the previous strategy, which was keeping drugs out of prison. So that would be great if we could do that, but it'd be great if we could keep drugs out of Ireland.
Yeah.
So then the next part is treatment and support. So for addiction, it's not just stop taking the drugs. It's a lot more complex and a lot more dynamic. So for some of us that might like chocolate, or we might like a glass of wine, or we might like a cigarette, they're in moderation. But for illicit substances, which is known as contraband in the prison, a scourge in our community at large, and a scourge on the person and their families, and it can have immediate effects, overdose. So what we do in terms of treatment, we have an excellent medical team, and they will assess the women when they come in. So they might come in intoxicated. Most of them will come in with an addiction, more than 70%. We could have 70 women on methadone every single day, and that's not just handing out the methadone. There's a background to that. We've a very, very good pharmacy service, and they actually look after the methadone clinic. So that's a treatment for heroin addiction, opiate addiction, and we also treat by giving antidotes to some of the opiate.
Like Narcan and stuff like that, yeah.
Exactly, naloxone. If somebody takes too much of an opiate, it can depress their respiratory system.
Yes, yeah.
And basically they can die. So the prison service in general, which has spilled over into the Dochas, has done a lot to counteract the dangers, which is very mortality
important.
dangers and morbidity dangers, so that if they can get the naloxone. So there's that immediate first aid treatment, but then there's the support and the addiction counselling. It's to get to the bottom of what's causing the addiction and to support. So that's not necessarily cured overnight. That can take a lot more behind the scenes. So there's that. And then we would have addiction counsellors, and we have Merchants Key Ireland as well, who they're like our in-reach services. So they're all very, very helpful with the addiction treatment and support. So obviously we have drug testing as well, urine testing and swab testing, and we basically help the women to try and overcome their addiction. And it's not just medical in that respect. If I'm talking to them as well, when I see them on committal, I'll ask them those questions.
And we've seen that in the documentary, the questions that they're asked upon coming in, about their history and all that sort of stuff. So that's an important part of it as well, is getting to know them at that initial stage.
Absolutely. So then the third tenet to the drug strategy then is to educate and inform. So we mentioned at the start that how important education is. So there are some synthetic drugs out there that are very, very dangerous. And if somebody takes a substance that they don't even know what it is, like who would do that? But if somebody does that, it's a huge risk.
Yeah.
And, there have been some alerts out, sent out by the HSE out on the streets. Same risks can apply inside as well. And we need to educate the women. You mentioned about peer support, how important that was. So our Red Cross volunteers would actually they would do up some of the leaflets and alerts and would actually talk to some of the other women and alert them to the dangers of it, so that if we inform them and if we educate them, and then obviously our schools as well, in some of their classes, some of the classes are tailored towards addiction issues as well. So they're the 3 tenets of the drug strategy, which replaces the previous one, which was keeping drugs out of prison.
Yeah.
Much broader. Obviously, there's a lot more technology and to try and counteract them coming in the first place, then treat anyone that has the addiction and support them, and then educate and inform. So any one of those could come first, depending on which part of the cycle the woman is in.
Yeah, it seems like a more proactive approach, instead of denying it and saying it doesn't happen, to actually be like, okay, it does happen. How can we educate? How can we, prevent mortality, all those sort of things? It seems like it's a more, modern approach, I suppose, to dealing with the issue in prison.
Yes, you're quite right. It's actually acknowledging that there is a problem in society, and the only way to try and deal with it is to detect it, acknowledge it, treat it, and educate.
Well, Mary Kennedy, thank you so much. You can watch Women Locked Up inside the Dochas and see all of the wonderful stories from inside the Dochas Centre, and that's on Virgin Media. Thank you very much, Mary Kennedy.
Thank you very much, Clodagh. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.